In this video we are going to talk about the level of democracy and capitalism in the different regions of the world in the 19th century.
Well, first of all, what is democracy and capitalism?
Democracy is a system of government based in four elements. The first one is that you as a citizen can choose or replace your governor through free and fair elections, the active participation of people as citizens in politics and civic life, protection of human rights of everybody, and the rule of laws and procedures that apply equally to all citizens and humans.
We are also talking about anocracy. Anocracy is a system of government where power is vested in largely self-appointed political elites rather than in public institutions. In this video, we are also talking about colonialism and imperialism.
What is colonialism? Colonialism is generally defined as the occupation and control of one nation by another. Do you know of any countries around the world, either in or outside of Africa, which have been colonized at some point in their history? Over the last few hundred years, various European nations have colonized many areas of the world.
These European colonies were in North and South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, and various smaller islands around the world. European nations colonized Africa from the late 19th century until the middle to later 20th century. Although Europeans had contact with many parts of Africa much longer than this, for example, through the Atlantic slave trade, they did not impose a formal rule of law over Africa until this time period.
Now we're talking about Africa and Europe. The 19th century in Europe was a time of industrialization, so factories and industries needed raw materials to be manufactured into products for the market. As a result, Europe looked for both a source of raw materials and market for manufactured goods in Africa. In time, this led to colonization.
This was an advancement for capitalism in Europe because of the improvement and expansion of their industries, but it was a step back for democracy in Africa because their resources were being taken from them without their consent, and many Africans became very poor.
Nationalism was another reason for colonization in Africa. Nationalism is the strong identification and pride of one's nation. This resulted in competition between European nations, which led to wars over African colonization. They wanted to be more powerful than the others, have more territories. These are some of the causes of the scramble for Africa, which was the colonization of all of Africa in just 25 years.
To all of this, there were ideologies of hierarchy in Europe. Many Europeans felt like the superior, most advanced and civilized race, and also they felt that it was their mission and responsibility to enlighten and civilize the rest of the people of the world.
This feeling of racial superiority and responsibility was captured in a poem written in 1899, The White Man's Burden, by the British poet Rudyard Kipling. Many inaccurate and racialized stereotypes of African people, which existed at the time, were used to justify colonialism in Africa.
This was a huge step back for democracy, because the black people were being very discriminated and the Europeans thought that they had no rights. So they treated them as such. So by the end of the 19th century, there was no democracy in Africa. Europe had it completely colonized without respecting the people or their resources.
In the early days of colonialism, European nations allowed private companies to establish in many territories of Africa. These companies were formed by businessmen who were interested in exploiting the natural resources of the territories they were allowed to govern.
These companies could set up their own taxation system.
This was a good deal for the European countries. They had the political benefit of having additional colonies in Africa, but not the expense. This improved European economy and became a great source of income for them. But the fact that the companies could set their own system of taxation and labor recruitment basically meant that they could take advantage of the Africans and exploit their resources as much as they want. Something that goes totally against democracy.
Next, North America. The period from 1820s to 1840 was a time of important political developments. Voting by voice was eliminated. Direct methods of selecting presidential electors, county officials, state judges, and governors replaced indirect ways of choosing your representative leader.
Voter participation increased. A new two-party system replaced the politics of the deference to the upper class. One of the important political persons was Andrew Jackson, who opened millions of acres of Indian lands to white settlement, destroyed the Second Bank of the United States, and denied the right of a state to cancel the federal tariff.
After the War of 1812, the American economy grew at an astounding rate. The development of the steamboat by Robert Fulton revolutionized water travel and did the building of canals.
The construction of the Erie Canal stimulated an economic revolution that bound the grain basket of the West to the eastern and southern markets. Capitalism! During the first half of the 19th century, reformers launched unprecedented campaigns to reduce drinking, establish prisons, create public schools, educate the deaf and the blind, abolish slavery, and extend equal rights to women. Slavery in the United States. For 40 years, attempts were made to resolve conflicts between North and South. The Missouri Compromise prohibited slavery in the northern half of the Louisiana Purchase. The acquisition of vast new territories during the 1840s reignited the question of slavery in the western territories.
The Compromise of 1850 was an attempt to solve this problem by admitting California as a free state but allowing slavery in the rest of the Southwest. But the compromise included a fugitive slave law opposed by many Northerners. The Kansas-Nebraska Act proposed to solve the problem of status, thereby popular sovereignty.
But this led to violent conflict in Kansas and the rise of the Republican Party. The Dred Scott decision eliminated possible compromise solutions to the sectional conflict, and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry convinced many Southerners that a majority of Northerners wanted to free the slaves and incite race war.
To understand how democracy was in Latin America during this period, we need to talk first about the state building. The beginning of the era where democracy starts to develop for Latin America was marked by liberal victory in the ideological struggles that followed independence. The building of the nation-state was initially founded on the sectors of the bureaucracy and the army that were brought from the colonial period.
However, it undergoes a series of great changes after the Revolution of 1810, especially during the Wars of Independence that happened between 1810 and 1870. These wars were a big step for democracy now that the people are demanding their freedom, because they feel they deserve better treatment, they want rights, and the liberalist ideas begin to influence greatly.
In most of the new nations that are being formed, the long years of independence and civil wars start to demand that the stable military and police forces be formed in order to construct the indispensable monopoly violence that characterizes state domination.
Likewise, the state obtains all its resources from two primary sources. One is that in most of the countries where the indigenous presence is still a significant part of the population, their tribute continues to represent one of the pillars of state's resources.
On the other hand, in the rest of the new nations of Latin America, the budget of the state is based on income derived from foreign trade. When this foreign trade began to happen, capitalism developed greatly. The economy began to grow and the industry started to expand. But it also was limited because the income that sustained these budgets were almost entirely derived from importations.
In Asia, we are talking about the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860 marked a stage in Asia because it was what made Asia start trading with the West. China's defeats only caused that their military rulers forced them to build many ports and they could start trading.
The restrictions imposed under the Canton system were abolished. Opium, despite imperial prohibitions, now became a regular item of trade. As opium flooded into China, its price dropped, local consumption increased rapidly, and the drug penetrated all levels of society. In the new treaty ports, foreign traders collaborated with a greater variety of Chinese merchants than under the Canton system, and they ventured deeply into the Chinese interior.
Missionaries brought Christian teachings to villagers, protected by the diplomatic rights obtained under the treaties. Popular hostility to the new foreigners began to rise. This was a big step back in democracy because China was being forced and extortioned, so they could finally accept the opium trade, and this caused indirectly that some Western influences filtrated their culture. But it was a huge jump forwards in capitalism because Western potentials can finally expand.
And at last, we are talking about the Middle East. One of the most common religions in the Middle East is Islam. Has always been favorable to education and literacy, so that Muslims may read the Quran for themselves. The world's first universities were established by Muslims to accomplish this goal.
Women were usually taught to read the Quran at home, although some schools were established over the centuries for girls only. Separate palace schools to educate women of the harem in reading, writing, geography, and drawing were evident for some time. Once imperialism began, then foreign missionaries who followed the conquerors also established schools for girls as early as the 1830s.
The Coptic Christian community in Egypt also did the same in the 1850s. By the last decades of the 19th century, members of the emerging middle class in the Middle East had more links to Europe, and thus followed their direction of using female teachers to educate females, as it was not proper for males to teach women. In 1872, the Women's Teachers Training School was founded in Constantinople. By 1900s, one had been established in Cairo.